I am your program director, and I'm very pleased to play that role. And I just want to let you know, GSOC's mission is to foster interest in geology and teach public education about geology and foster people's interest in geology. So we made a decision several years ago to keep at the forefront always the significant earthquake risk that we face here in the Pacific Northwest. And so in keeping with that, we have a special speaker tonight, and I'm going to let Paul Edison Lam, who contracted with her, I'm going to let him introduce her. So I think you'll enjoy tonight's program.
Well, yes, this is our second time welcoming Allison as a GSOC lecturer. I think we had you back in person in April of 2016, which seems like an era ago.
It's actually 3 or 4, because I think Yume and I gave a talk first after Chile, and then there was another one somewhere in there. So,
oh my goodness. Okay, well, I'll finish my introduction. You're a graduate of OSU Whitman and our very own Lincoln High School here in Portland. Now Senior Associate Resilience and Geotechnical Engineer at Hart Krauser and a Resilience Engineer with Salis Resilience, where she consulted recently and authored a very important recent report commissioned by Multnomah County and Portland Bureau of Emergency Management. And that report, and I'll put the link in the chat here, that report is the impacts of a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake on the critical energy infrastructure, the CEI hub. And I was, I think, particularly interested in having Allison back at this time because of her authorship of that report, and because some of us have spent some months lobbying our legislators for a bill to increase regulation of the critical energy infrastructure, and are happy to announce that the draft of that bill dropped this week. So, and there's a link in the chat to that as well. So Allison's work could not come at a better time. Please welcome Allison Pyrch.
thanks, Paul. Me. Share screen. And I just flipped through these and realized when I updated them to the new PowerPoint, everything changed size. So it is all entirely my fault that all the pictures are a little bit smaller, but I apologize for that.
We'll forgive you.
Yes, updated to the new PowerPoint or something. I don't know what happened, but it looks a little funky. So thank you everybody for coming. I understand I've presented before. Yume has presented before. I know she's on the call somewhere. And so I know that you guys understand the seismic risk that we have here. And so my presentation today is more a discussion of what's going on around that seismic resilience and what we're doing and what's happening around the state and what you can do to help further that forward. So just a quick refresher, the latest data out of Oregon State on the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake shows that we've got a recurrence interval between 230 and about 480 years. And if you all recall, we're at 320, almost at 322 now, 322 years. So we are well into overdue for, or definitely due for this earthquake. These are the four most common patterns of breakage along the fault. And if you can see, Oregon is here. So this is the 2/3 of Oregon, all of Oregon up into Washington, and then the entire fault, which is about a 9.2. So in general, we've had 42 of these earthquakes in the last 10,000 years. We're pretty much on a conveyor belt. And as you can see, there's been a reasonable gap compared to the ones that we've had previously. So from a design standpoint, we definitely consider that this is an imminent problem. And to remind everybody, we found out about this early we're looking at it in the 80s, and in the 90s decided that it was probably a problem. And so anything built before 1994 in Oregon did not include significant seismic shaking, if any. So if you think about everything that's been built before 1994 in Oregon, that's where we're definitely at risk. So Chris Goldfinger, the one who works at Oregon State and did all of this nice data, is usually comes to these talks and says that he came to Oregon to prove that Cascadia was a locked and was not actually a risk. And every time he does his work, he proves himself wrong and the answer gets worse. So we are definitely expecting a large earthquake. So I guess the question is, when we talk about seismic resilience from a geology standpoint, what are we talking about with resilience? And in general, it's the ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions. So how do we bounce back after an event, whether it be a winter storm, a wildfire, or a large earthquake? This is one of my favorite photos that we got from partners in Chile when Yume and I were down in Chile. This is a bridge that crossed a fairly large river, and the detour to this bridge was about 5 hours long. So the local solution is they had ladders that they would go and they'd have cars on one side and cars on the other side, and they go and haul their groceries and everything else up and down the ladders all the way across the river. So if that's one example of how to be resilient when you have a broken bridge. So since that's not the ideal situation, especially in an area that has a lot of rivers, our goal is to mitigate hazards, which reduces our risks. And really what we're trying to do is decrease response and recovery times, right? So let's bounce back as quickly as possible. And that's an important thing to consider when we're talking about all of these different bills and other actions. Emergency response is rescuing, meeting immediate needs of the public, getting everybody rescued, fed, watered, and sheltered right away, right? So emergency response is what the emergency managers are in charge of. We definitely need to think beyond that period. So if we look at what reduces our recovery time, how do we get kids back in school, people back to work, transportation up and running such that our community can actually go forward, that's where we're looking at recovery. So as much as response is very important, if we focus on recovery when we're looking at our resilience efforts here in Oregon, that response gets a lot easier. Because if our infrastructure can handle an event and bounce back quickly, our response gets a lot easier and our recovery gets a lot shorter. You and I gave a presentation years ago to Multnomah County, and they happened to actually bring the financial people in for once. And they kind of talked about it and they said, you know, our funding is business tax, gas tax, and property tax. If nobody's working and nobody's buying gas, or there's no gas for them to buy, and their property values go down, we are insolvent in about 2 weeks. So having appropriate infrastructure that can handle the hazards that we're anticipating are really what we need for our community to thrive and actually jump back after one of these events. So resilience has been, seismic resilience has been a subject here for many years, but really especially since that Chile earthquake in 2010 has it really become more of a priority here. Thanks to a lot of my predecessors and mentors who have been pushing it from the engineering and geology side. NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, ASCE, are all working on how do we think about resilience. And it really actually started to boom even more after Hurricane Sandy, because that affected the East Coast. And as most people in Oregon know, when things affect the East Coast, it becomes important. So it started to be a little bit more of a topic on the national stage. And in general, we start off with goal development. So what are the hazards that we're looking at? And how do we want to respond to those hazards? What is the goal that we want to have? What do we want to be happening a day after, a week after, a month after, etc. Once we have those goals, you do a physical assessment, look at your existing conditions based on the hazards. What are the vulnerabilities that we anticipate there? And then taking those vulnerabilities, coming into a prioritization. So here's our assessment. We come up with mitigation. We prioritize that mitigation. And the prioritization, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but that is actually a pretty big piece, especially in a place where we don't have a whole lot of funding. And once we've done those steps, then you start to move it into actual plans, capital improvement plans, long-term planning, master plans, so that we're actually considering resilience as we move forward. So in Oregon and Washington, and actually in a lot of the country, this is a really big problem. So how do we actually scale it down so that it's not a big issue? one of the things that I've often gotten, or comments I've had, is, well, it's all going to fall down anyway. Why don't we just let it all fall down and build things back? That is not how we have a resilient society. So if we want Oregon and Washington and the Pacific Northwest to survive afterwards, we need to take some action now so that it doesn't all fall down. So that prioritization piece of mitigation, it's focusing on critical facilities. So what do we have to have first, right? In an electrical system or a water system, that's the source. What is generating water, power, natural gas, etc. So harden the source, harden the main transmission lines as you get to those areas. So, and then after that, you go into distribution, right? If we have the source safe, if the water reservoir is seismically sound, if the electrical generation happens and is seismically sound, that's good. Once you put it into the transmission, that gets you into the general areas where the population is. And then after that comes the distribution. So little steps. So if your source and your transmission don't work, it doesn't really matter if your distribution is up and running. So that's how we look at the critical facilities. For a community or a business, a campus, you want your hospitals, you want your shelters, you want your emergency facilities, your public works facilities. You need to have that up and running so that you can get everybody else going. So that's something that we think about when we're looking at all of these resilience efforts here in the state. And then there's also the low-hanging fruit, right? Where are places that are cheap and easy to build resilience? And I've got a couple of examples of that when I talk a little bit later about some of the things that we're doing in the state. So where is it that we can apply our funds directly and get a good bang for our buck right away with the kind of low-hanging fruit idea? So it's an interesting way to look at it. When you consider the fact that most of our infrastructure is something that the public in general just doesn't think about. They expect their roads to be going, they expect their bridges to be up and running, they expect that water to run out of their tap, they expect their cell phone to be working in the morning when they wake up. All of those things are just expected. So if we have physical infrastructure that is not working at any particular time, how is it that we're going to get that back up and running so that society can move forward? So there are values to having resilient infrastructure. There are values to having things that are available for emergency response. It is a value to the community to have a hospital that is seismically sound and up and running immediately after an event, correct? So what we have to look at when we're doing these assessments is the costs. There's some physical hard costs of just the cost of repair, the cost of replacement, the loss of use cost, casualties and human personnel losses. And then the value of that's sometimes a little bit more amorphous, that what is the value of having things that are accessible immediately after a disaster? And public perception is a big one that's hard to quantify. In general, FEMA has upped this in the last couple years. On average, every $6 or every dollar we spent in mitigation before a disaster saves us $6 afterwards. That's because it's more expensive to do afterwards. It takes more time. And in general, all of those fuzzy costs, the ability to actually have it open, the loss of use, the casualties, all of that is rolled into that. So if we can spend money up front, we actually save money in general. So when we're going and speaking to legislatures or speaking to people who are funding these things, that's a big point, is you are actually saving money if you're doing it up front. This is an interpretation of a graph that is used in a lot of these planning efforts. It was created by Kent Yu and Yimei Wang. It's a fairly standard resilience target that's based on experience around the world in some of these events. So a timeline of 3 days to get everybody fed, watered, sheltered, and rescued. In 3 weeks, you've restored pre-disaster service levels. So you may have some areas that have porta potties or temporary water, or they might be using a different building, but in general, those people are back to school and back to work. And after 3 years, you've restored everything that broke and you're actually better and are better off for the next disaster. Chile, Japan, or even Mexico are good examples of where this occurs. They have had enough earthquakes. They've been designing for long enough that when they have one of these large disasters that they've had in 2010, 2011, and 2017, they all bounce back fairly quickly. Currently, we are not necessarily at that location or at that level of resilience here in Oregon and Washington. So that's kind of the goal that we're looking for when we're doing these planning efforts. So I'm hoping everybody knows that the Oregon Resilience Plan exists. It's a 50-year plan. Chile, Japan, Mexico, all 30 to 50 years ago had a very large earthquake. They had a lot of damage, a lot of death. They decided they needed to do something different and they changed some things. And that's kind of our thought is if we have 50 years, we're hoping that we have 50 years to plan. This plan is now it's 9 years old. So it's almost 10 years old. What is it that we can do? This was a volunteer effort led by ASC engineers to put it together, ASC engineers in OSPAC. 170 people around the state volunteered. Some of you may have volunteered for this effort. And it was a wake-up call. It was a please, we need help. Let's do something about this. The results can be summarized pretty quickly in a table. And I think this is true still 10 years later, that I think this is optimistic in many cases. We are looking at months to years before we recover a lot of systems, especially out in the coast and isolated areas that will be affected by tsunamis. So we're looking for months before people have electricity, months before police and fire stations are fully operable, months to years before our water and sewer systems are back and running, months to years before our transportation system is up and running, and then even healthcare facilities are vulnerable. So it was a big red flag to everybody in the state that said we actually need help. Washington State also has one of these plans, and the answer is pretty much the same. Is they have this is their target. They want to be 1 to 3 days for water supply, weeks to a month for wastewater electricity, flood control back up and running in a week to month. That's their target. Oops. Where they ended up was very similar to Oregon. They're looking to weeks to months, and mainly months to years before they're up and running again as well. So I was recent 2017, which sometimes feels like recently and sometimes feels like decades ago, given the 2020 situation that we're in. But in Mexico, looking at some of the things that they have done since their 1985 earthquake. And I think this is somewhere where we definitely need to learn some lessons. They developed evacuation plans and drills. Everybody in Mexico City knows what to happen when the earthquake early warning goes off, and they get out of those buildings quickly. They can get adults out of a building in 2 minutes flat, several story buildings in 2 minutes flat. If any of you are teachers or have recently been anywhere near a fire drill, you know that that is not usually possible here in the United States. They developed the earthquake early warning system, which is something that we currently have here, and I'll talk about a little bit later. They changed their building codes to require better than life safety standards, which I'll also talk in a little bit. And after this 2017 earthquake, there will be additional changes to their codes because they felt that they did not do well enough. And then they did global education initiatives all over the country in multiple languages and media to make sure that everybody understood that they lived in earthquake country, what to do when one happened, and to make sure that everybody was prepared. And that's, I think, really a very good example for what we need to do here. So what have we been doing here in the United States, or especially in the Northwest? So in looking at that priority system, that source, critical transmission distribution, ODOT has done something very similar. And ODOT did this early on. They started this effort after the Chile earthquake. They evaluated their bridges. They evaluated the landslide hazards across the state. And they tiered their system to have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, which is restored within days to weeks, and within weeks to months. So what do we need moving right away? What do we need moving pretty soon after that? And then what can wait? And then understanding that they had a very vulnerable system, they actually phased it. So this effort over here is actually the phasing of the program. So this is when they get money, they are doing it in a concentrated way, in a planned way. So they're not randomly seismically retrofitting all over the state, but they're retrofitting in corridors. So we have more corridors open as soon as possible. So phase 1, if you see, is 97, Highway 97 all the way over here. The reason is they don't have as much earthquake hazard over there. So it's easier to fix everything to get up to par. And it's one that goes through all the way up and down north and south to the state through the Bend area, which they're anticipating is going to be a place. Bend and Redmond are going to be a place where we're going to be able to get a lot of help in quickly because there will be less damage there. So phase 1 is a circle through the main areas of the valley and 97. And then it goes on to phase 2 and phase 3 and phase 4. So as they get funding, they are fixing it in a way such that they're building resilience as quickly as they can, recognizing that there's a limited amount of funding. There's been a lot of work on airports as well, recognizing that our transportation system, our ground transportation system is very vulnerable. We've done assessments at 4 or 5 airports through the Oregon Department of Aviation, and then the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and the state have done a transportation study that looked at all forms of transportation, including an evaluation of different airports. And so highlighting some specific things that need to be done to make sure that we have some critical airports around the state up and running. And then the Oregon Department of Aviation is looking to further that work with some grant applications that they put in this year. So hopefully we'll be doing not only evaluating the airports from a seismic standpoint, but developing a plan for how to get funding into those airports to make them resilient so that we can use them after a large event. This is the one that Paul touched on. There are statewide and local fuel planning efforts currently happening. So 95% of Oregon and Southwest Washington's fuel is stored on the North Willamette, where we expect it to be on fire and much closer to the river than it is now. It's a major vulnerability for the area. There's been studies by the county and the city. UMA did one for Dogami that have highlighted the problem. And so now we have some legislation to actually request that it's basically requiring these companies to do seismic assessments and to start to plan for changes to those areas to make them safer. In recognition that that's probably some time off, there's also statewide and county and even local fuel planning efforts going on to diversify our fuel stores, look at more resilient and frankly more green types of fuel, and how do we move closer to using more green types of fuel, as well as just diversifying where we store it. Instead of storing it all right here, we need to store it in a lot of different locations so that we have access to the fuel and it's seismically sound where it's stored. So very few of these things are final and moved forward, but there is definitely planning going on. They recognize that this is one of our biggest problems. The earthquake ready Burnside Bridge. So City of Portland and the Multnomah County have recognized that we have very few river crossings in Portland that will be, if any, that will be fully functional immediately after an earthquake. And so they have set forth, they picked the Burnside Bridge because it is connected to Burnside, which goes all the way to Washington County and Clackamas County. There's some fixes that we need to do on either of those ways, but it's one of the most direct and least bridge heavy ways to get through all of those counties. And so as the critical hinge point through downtown Portland, they are on the way of having a seismically retrofitted bridge with the goal of having it be usable immediately afterwards. So that project is ongoing. There are frequent public meetings to that one if people are interested in it. It's Google earthquake ready Burnside Bridge, and they frequently have information and open houses to get everybody's opinion. On the county level, Josephine County started this off, but this is an example where prioritization comes forward. We did an evaluation of 26 bridges throughout the Grants Pass area down in Josephine County. And then we went to rank them based on vulnerability and other things. And if you did the engineering vulnerability of what's going to fail most catastrophically and be most expensive to fix, some pretty large bridges moved forward. And then the I-5 bridges ended up being kind of high on the list. And we looked at it and we said, well, let's map where the hospitals are. Let's map where your public works facilities are. Let's map some other things and look around and see, are there some ways that we can prioritize these bridges differently? And I don't know if my mouse is showing, but this, if you look at up at the top half of the very top of the graph where I-5 is, there's a light blue line to the left of I-5. There's the I-5 bridges along this route are very vulnerable, but Monument Drive on the other side has 3 single span bridges that the county, Josephine County, has the capacity to fix easily, fairly cheaply, and almost within their regular maintenance staff. And so when we went through and weighted the bridges, we added not just seismic vulnerability, but we added criticality, whether it provides a detour, if it provided access to isolated populations. We got a much different look at some of these bridges. So these gigantic bridges that were multiple spans that would be really expensive to retrofit, we got 3 bridges that were significantly easier to fix, that were along this. And not only did it provide a detour to I-5, it was a cheaper detour to I-5, and it provided to several public works facilities and health facilities that were emergency response locations that helped quite a bit. So this is what we mean when we talk about looking at it from a different lens, not just from an engineering standpoint, what's the worst and what do we need to fix, but how does it actually affect emergency response and recovery? This effort has been taken, ODOT liked it, and they have been doing this with every county on the west side of the Cascades. And so every county now has started this process, or is somewhere in the middle of it, or some of them have even finished it. And then the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization, which is the 5 counties in the metro area, including Clark County and Washington. So Columbia County, Washington County, Multnomah County, and Clackamas County, and Clark County and Washington, had an emergency transportation route project. And so they took that initial piece and we looked at their emergency transportation routes as they were existing. We overlaid them with the liquefaction maps, the landslide maps, the flood hazard maps, and we rated them and looked at access to all of the critical facilities, to vulnerable populations, and we tried to develop a more robust emergency transportation network. So this is phase 1 was completed last year, where we did a lot of the mapping and the data collection so that we have a collection of routes, and we identified those emergency routes throughout the area. And you can see the blue lines are the state lifeline routes that have been identified in Oregon, and the orange ones are the regional routes, and then yellow are the local routes as well. So look, and some of those are bus routes. So these are the routes. We looked at them. We looked at transit centers, fuel points, public works facilities, healthcare facilities, fire stations, etc. And we did an algorithm to make sure that we were providing appropriate connectivity to all of those places with the routes, and where we didn't have it, we added it. And then we looked at those routes based on liquefaction and landslides and lateral spread and other things to determine what were most vulnerable, and then do we need to duplicate routes in order to help the resilience of those. In the metro area, frankly, we're pretty good. This is the metro area, but in the city, we're actually pretty good. Where it starts to point out that we have some major holes are especially Columbia County, and then out in rural areas where we have very few, they're high landslide and or liquefaction and bridge issues. Because we did look at ODOT's bridge data as well, can cause issues out there, and there's not a whole lot of redundancy in routes. So within, downtown Portland or Southeast Portland, there's a lot of different routes that we can use that a lot of times don't necessarily have many bridges. But as you get outside into the region, There's some rural areas, some vulnerable areas that have trouble with connectivity. So the end result of this was we had a total of 1,200 miles with 195 routes in the entire region. 75% of state and regional critical infrastructure and essential facilities were connected, which means they were less than a quarter mile to one of these regional routes. And the number went way up if we went to a half mile. And we added 305 miles and 89 new routes to that. So the key findings that we went through, like I said, some areas have very limited alternative routes. So rural areas outside of town have some major problems. A big push everywhere in Oregon, but also our metro area, is we really need to seismically strengthen our bridges. It's a major gap that we've got. And then providing access to community and vulnerable populations is a big one as well. In general, vulnerable populations tend to be hit harder by natural disasters, so we need to make sure that they're included in the effort. And so that was this project. Our main lessons learned besides that, getting stakeholder engagement up front is really important. We need to understand how these emergency routes are used, how things are happening. The decisions need to be data-driven and not politically driven. So like the Burnside Bridge is not necessarily the most politically acceptable one if you talk to other counties, but it is the best one from a data-driven standpoint. So we need to really make sure that we're paying attention to what the data is telling us. And then what comes out of all of these efforts is transportation connects everything. When you talk to water, wastewater, electrical, especially when we did the resilience plan, I think everybody was expecting the resilience plan, everybody to stand, all the different groups, the wastewater and the energy and everything, we were expecting them all to stand up and say, we're the most important, we need to fix us, this is why we're important. They all stood up and said, we're toast, and we're totally toast if we don't have a transportation system, because we can't actually fix anything if we can't get there. So transportation is rising to the top of importance. And then knowing that we don't necessarily have all the answers to this, but we need to make the best effort that we possibly can. So this project is on RDPO's website. You can Google RDPO projects and they have all of their projects. But this one has a phase 2 that will be coming up in the next year or so. That will be a 2 to 3 year process. They will be further looking at these routes. They will be tiering them much like ODOT did, and then developing priorities for fixes so that we can come up with a better system and a more resilient system throughout, and fill some of those gaps. So the first phase really ended up being a lot of data gathering and map building so that we can do that second phase really well. Several counties are looking at disaster response plans. Just got under contract to work with Clackamas County to do one where they're looking at those emergency routes. They're looking at the bridges they expect to be down. They're looking at where they expect to have landslides, and they're developing active and very specific plans of what they need to do after the event happens. So where do our people live? If it happens during the day, what do we do with them? If it happens at night and they're at home, what do we do with them? Where do they go and what bridges do they do, so that we can get the best assessment possible as quickly after an event and start to get things up and running quickly. So that means bridge assessments, landslide assessments, looking at detour options, doing a mapping effort where we're looking at all of the overlays of these different hazards that we anticipate and trying to identify what their emergency routes should be and if they should tier them. All of those pieces. Water improvements are also happening. Many areas around the state are doing seismic improvements to their water systems. Portland and Gresham have been doing quite a bit, but there's several. Tualatin Valley is working on a large pipeline throughout the west side to make sure their transmission and their source are seismically sound. They're doing storage upgrades. Astoria is looking at did a transmission study to look at the seismic resilience of theirs due to landslides. RDPO is also doing an emergency drinking water planning effort. So we're working with them to look at how it is as a region that we provide emergency drinking water immediately after an event, and developing a framework for water providers to go through and develop a plan so that we have a significantly more detailed plan than we currently have now, that helps everybody plan how to provide drinking water to everybody. And then using Shake Alert. So using our earthquake early warning system to actually prevent issues with water systems. So closing valves on reservoirs so we don't lose water, shutting off pumps to save them during shaking, that type of thing. So what can we do with a Shake Alert system? There's a lot of systems around the state that are incorporating Shake Alert into their seismic planning. And then wastewater resilience assessments are also being done. They're a little bit behind water, but they're starting to come into it and do wastewater resilience assessments as well. Oops. Some of the biggest things that were done that are helping all of these efforts is Dogami is doing a lot of mapping and damage assessments based on both the Portland Hills Fault earthquake as well as Cascadia. So a new ton of data that actually looks at population density, damage estimates, ground movement estimates, shaking estimates, to really inform all of these studies that we're doing. So in having better data to you and to be able to use GIS mapping to do overall planning efforts across the state and across the region is really helping this effort. One of those things that's been done, both we're doing it currently at RDPO, but the federal RRAP study did it as well, is they're starting to identify islands. So we recognize that because of landslides, because of liquefaction, because of bridge failure, the state and the region are actually going to be broken up into islands. So there are going to be places we're going to have trouble moving across rivers, across mountainous areas. So you're going to have people that are isolated. And so we're using that in the drinking water planning efforts that we're doing for RDPO. The state is using them from a state planning standpoint. And the Department of Human Services and Oregon Health Authority are doing a lot of work. They got a lot of funding in the last round to do emergency planning. We're going to take those federal identified islands and kind of vet them and modify them from a state standpoint so that they can be used for emergency planning around the state. So when they've got 15 emergency communication sets, you don't want to have 3 of them in one island. You want to have them spread out throughout the state. When you have emergency supplies, you need to make sure that they're spread throughout the areas. So the GIS efforts and the Dogami efforts have really helped further this planning along. Hospitals are doing quite a bit of work. This is a slide entirely on UMA's work, but one of the biggest things for hospitals is having water options and power options. So how do they look for alternative water and power to be up and running afterwards? Better planning to make sure that they've got 3 weeks of material to be able to house who they have and whoever comes in. And then making sure that when we build anything new, that it is being built to a level that we can actually use it afterwards, and it's considering all of these things to be resilient. There's several efforts to look at more resilient buildings. Beaverton Schools, in their planning efforts, they've done a resilience plan for the area. They recognize that they are going to be shelters for the community and shelters for other people. A community hub. So they're building their schools with that in mind, including emergency water storage, ability to handle large amounts of people if they don't have power, wastewater, and water. So that thought process is put into their planning. The state of Oregon is looking at doing some very resilient state buildings that are able to be used immediately afterwards, are built to a standard above a life safety so that we can use them afterwards, because a lot of our state buildings are very vulnerable. One of the things that actually I had a meeting yesterday or Wednesday about our ORSAP program. So these are photos from Mexico City, or right outside Mexico City and outside of Mexico City, actually, after the 2017 earthquake. And the number one thing that we heard, that our team heard from everybody, from the homeowners themselves to the building owners to the tops of the emergency management and building authorities, was that you have to have a red, yellow, green tag system that makes sense and people understand what it means. So these are some bad examples. If you look here, this is green paint, and A is for amarillo, which is yellow in Spanish. So this is a yellow tag done in green paint. Here is a building that somebody put a green tag on in black paint, I might say, because verde is for V. And somebody else came in and said, wait a minute, this is a red tag. So they didn't have a system that was enough to recognize serious problems. Now, if you have a building that's a red tag and a structural engineer comes and says, you know what, there's some cracks, but it's actually safe and goes to a green tag, that's okay. But you definitely don't want somebody telling people that a building is safe if it's actually unsafe. And then here's another example where this is a green tag, but that they actually wrote, or it's a yellow tag, but they wrote amarillo, yellow, out in green. So it's confusing. Nobody knew what it was doing, and they did not have a system where the inspectors were doing it on a consistent basis. So I want to say 2018, we put in a bill to the legislature. We finally got it passed in 2000. COVID's got my time scale. Anyway, it's been 4 or 5 years. We didn't get it passed. We got it passed, but we didn't get it funded, and we finally got it funded. And the funding hits March 1st of this year. So we are currently working to get a consistent red tag, yellow tag, green tag disaster assessment program here in Oregon. So we have it, it's funded, they're hiring the people to run it, and we're developing the program so that we have it. So this is actually a big win we've been waiting for quite some time. So those are some wins. There are definitely some things that we're still struggling with. So one of the big ones, I think you guys have talked about the URM planning as well, but from an understanding for code level design. So the building codes do not protect necessarily the buildings, they protect the life safety in it. So a normal level building that is designed today to current code, and this is true all over the world, unless they've done increased requirements, that has less than 5,000 people and is not a hospital or school, there's no requirement for it to be usable immediately after an earthquake. So all our new condo buildings, our new business buildings, all those new buildings, there's no guarantee that those people will be able to be in those buildings after an earthquake. It is likely that a lot of those people will not be able to be in their buildings. It is generally considered that it will be weeks to months before repairs are done so that that building is fully usable. When we're doing retrofits and other things, it's often not possible to get the building to life safety, and especially not possible to get to immediate occupancy. So often it's just a no collapse design. So if they're doing a retrofit to a very old building, it may just be trying to get it to the point where the building doesn't collapse. So that is the current standard code. There are a lot of places, both in California as well as Mexico City, Japan, and Chile have different codes where they're looking at it and saying, well, how can we design it better up front? If we're have to fix all the existing infrastructure, let's at least have the new stuff work better. And if we're retrofitting it, let's make sure we can retrofit it to a better standard. So hospitals, schools, anything that has over 5,000 people in it has to be designed to more of an immediate occupancy standpoint, where the building is most likely going to be fully usable afterwards. And so this is something where we have to talk to people about what code actually means so that people understand what's going on, and do we want to go to that immediate occupancy. Data out of New Zealand and Japan and some of the other places, the increase in cost at the time, if you're building a new building, the increase in cost to go from life safety to immediate occupancy in a structural standpoint is usually less than 4% of your cost. Usually between 1% and 2% of your upfront cost. The savings, if you just build a life safety building, most people can expect to spend 10 to 40% of their original construction costs to fix that building and get it back up and running. So it is a significant difference if you're doing it up front and you're doing it right. And that's what we need to educate people on, and potentially even require them to do. To try to get that any dollar you spend up front is saving you dollars on the end. It is true in buildings as well. So I think this is something that we will see coming up, and we'll need everybody pushing it, because there will be a lot of people saying we're spending too much money up front. But there are entities that are choosing this. I'm working with several clients that own their own buildings that think that this is important. So Beaverton Schools made this choice for the buildings that they did not have to be immediate occupancy. And I think it is something that people, if we start to educate people, they'll start to make this choice more and more. And then I think everybody knows about the URM disaster, when City of Portland really tried to go forward and do URM placarding to start to bring awareness, and that failed miserably. On multiple levels. But I think one of the things that I think we need to do as a state is realize that we can't just start to regulate it in little places, and we need to start, the cities and the counties and the state need to start as an example. Things like, what if we placarded what if every state, city, and county building had a placard on it that told you what the earthquake safety of the building was? So it was absolutely normal for you to go. When you're in Mexico City, when you're in Japan and you go in an elevator, it says, do not use in case of fire or earthquake. Now that does not necessarily save anybody's life, but if everywhere you go, it says this building is earthquake safe, this building is not earthquake safe, do not use the elevator in case of an earthquake. Here is the safe zone to evacuate to in the event of an earthquake. If we are walking around town and we're seeing these things on a regular basis, all of a sudden people start to think that we live in earthquake country, and you're changing the culture. I'm trying to get Multnomah County to they just put a sign in front of every bridge that says, do not cross in the event of an earthquake until inspected. There's absolutely nothing to do to the safety or anything else. But that means when people actually go and cross 26 bridges on their way to work, and they think about that, they're going to say, wait a minute, how am I going to get home after this if I can't cross any of those bridges? So we really need to start on the developing an earthquake culture. That's really where these other countries who have more frequent earthquakes are ahead of us. And even California, to some extent, as much as they struggle with a lot of these things as well, they at least have earthquakes more frequently. And then we also are struggling with our tsunami code. We currently have not adopted the most recent tsunami codes in Oregon, and that's a wine conversation all by itself. There's a lot of misinformation about the tsunami information that's going forward. There's a lot of, I think, even within our community, people that don't understand how the state statutes work and how building codes work. And so if this comes up and you're curious about it, I'm happy to provide my opinion. But I do think that we need to have a much better conversation in the state about what those codes mean. And where we regulate these things, because if we're putting it in state statutes that doesn't have a lot and giving it to certain places that may not have any purview, it's not really doing us any good. We need to consider what people actually have to pay attention to. So building codes, land use, zoning, all those types of things where we can actually make a difference and change how we're building and how we're designing buildings and communities. So this is the earthquake warning system in Mexico City. All of these people got out of the building. It is still shaking. So it is still shaking, and they are out of the building and avoided that collapse. So the earthquake early warning goes off. Everybody knows what to do. They get out of all of their buildings. And this, as much as it's a failure of the building, it was a win because all of those people were standing in the street and were safe. We now have earthquake early warning in Oregon. I can't see all of your hands because I'm presenting, but I wonder who has it on their phone, who knows it happens, and if you have any idea what to do when you actually get that alert. And you guys are probably some of the more educated on the planet or in the state. So we have earthquake early warning. We have the governor's bill in 2019, I think, that actually was going to fund some educational programs so that we can figure out how to use earthquake early warning, was not funded. So what we really, really need in this state is a lot of education on what to do about earthquake early warning. So if you consider the fact that we are in the Cascadia subduction zone and we could potentially have a couple minutes of warning, what could you do in that couple minutes to make yourself safer? And the other part is What would you, can you imagine if everybody had it on their cell phones at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when kids are in school and people are on all those bridges downtown, if that went off on everybody's cell phone? You would have absolute chaos. You would have people doing things that are unsafe. You would have people downtown in the buildings that have unreinforced masonry building running outside of them and being in more danger because they're where all the bricks can fall on them. You'd be having stupid people doing stupid things on bridges. And the thing with earthquake early warning systems that people in Mexico and Japan understand is that false alarms happen. So we could potentially have some major issues with a false alarm if we don't actually complete education and get people to know how to use it and actually figure out how to use it as a state so that it is a tool to make people safer. So whether we're doing evacuation versus duck cover and hold, it is currently a duck cover and hold situation, but there are definitely places where if people were educated in certain places, they could be evacuating. We need to be doing entire city drills that are mandatory. And we need to be doing it from all levels. So education at all levels so people know what to do. So this is one where we now have earthquake early warning. The question is, how do we actually use it and how do we get people to use it? So that's actually the end of my slides. But the next legislative session is coming up. There will be a bill about the CEI hub. There may be some additional bills, and really what we need is your support in city councils, county commissioners, with your state representatives to let them know that seismic resilience is important to us. We care about it. We want it to be a priority, so that some of these things get passed forward. I think we'll have a really interesting governor's race this year, and so we'll see how we go forward with that as well. And that is all I've got. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody wants to pop up and answer questions, or just start a discussion on how we can do better as a community.
Yeah, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I'm going to go ahead and give you the questions that people have put in the chat, starting at the top with Charlie's question. He says, immediately after an earthquake, during the response, would FEMA be moving people out of the disaster area, or would
That is, so it's currently
everyone to shelter in place? Hey, go ahead.
So it's currently, there are evacuation plans, but that is not their first, that is not going to be the first thing they're going to be doing. And immediately after an earthquake, it's going to take them time to mobilize and to get here because of all of the transportation issues that we're going to have. So immediately after an earthquake for FEMA is going to be 1 to 2 weeks minimum. So that is why OEM, FEMA, everybody, the conversation in Oregon and Washington is be prepared to be on your own for 2 weeks. No firemen, no policemen, nothing. Be on your own with your neighbors for 2 weeks. After that, there will be FEMA response and other people coming in and starting to do those things. But mass evacuation is not the first plan.
The point I'm having to deal with, I'm a member of NET, Neighborhood Emergency Teams, and PBIM asked the St. John's area to form a community resiliency district. And some of those people in the community resilience are expecting us to be moved out into a safe place. I'm thinking there'll be months, months before we move, if at all.
They need to be ready to be sheltering in place for a minimum of 2 weeks, and there will not be mass evacuation. And if it is, it will be probably injured first. And those that need dialysis and other types of things would be the ones that would happen first. So
is there any, this is written anywhere that FEMA will require most people to
I'd be amazed if you could not get either the city CERT-net person or an emergency manager to give a presentation, or one of us, somebody to give a presentation to push that forward. I'm not sure if it's, I mean, everything you read says be ready for 2 weeks. Minimum. So that is there, minimum 2 weeks. But it is not in any plan to do mass evacuations.
Right. Okay, thanks very much.
So I can see the chat. I can't remember who was telling us, but who was reading the chat to me. I can see it now. I've got it open. Now I'm not presenting. Yes, have your emergency preparedness kit ready. 2 weeks ready. I don't think that the ORP is necessarily benefited. So the question is, has the ORP benefited from the influx of federal pandemic aid? And what portions of the ORP are prioritized? I think currently fuel and transportation have been the most prioritized through the ORP. Although there is federal regulation that is requiring water systems to do seismic assessments. And so water systems is probably the next one that's been doing the most work. I don't think that the federal pandemic aid has helped with seismic resilience at all. The pandemic has taught us all that we can work from home, that we need to be more flexible, that we need to understand a lot of things. But I don't think that it's helped us with seismic resilience. I can get you guys a PDF of the presentation. Oh, although the video will be on the website, so that will work. The two newest, so how resilient are the two newest bridges in Portland? So the two newest bridges in Portland are the Selwood and the Tillicum, and then the Sauvie Island in the north side was built in 2006. So all of those bridges are good from the bridge standpoint and should be usable reasonably soon afterwards from the bridge itself. The problem is all of them have approach issues. So there are landslide problems along Highway 30. There are liquefaction and lateral spread problems around the bridge on Sauvie Island. Selwood has landslide issues on the west side, which were fixed immediately around the bridge or mitigated immediately around the bridge, but there could be potential issues getting to it on the west side. And then the Tillicum has liquefaction issues on both sides of the river. And so the approaches to the bridge will be a problem. So the bridges themselves were built to full code, if not above that, which for ODOT right now, it's usable after a 500-year earthquake, which is the operational after a 500-year earthquake, which is the Cascadia subduction zone. The Burnside Bridge and approaches are being looked at to be better than that, or operational after a Cascadia event, if not a little bit better. But the approaches on the three newest ones are going to be an issue. And there is there is a ferry company that is looking at doing something just to help commuting in Portland. And I think, the question is any effort to have some ferries ready. There is a ferry that is looking to help the Vancouver to Portland commute that has been discussed that way. In the transportation planning for Metro and RDPO, we have not done water systems yet, but that was identified in our first round of emergency transportation routes that we need to actually look at those routes. And so there's been discussion, but it's not official yet. The hospital in Gold Beach that was featured on Unprepared is exactly as stated in Unprepared. It was built in the tsunami zone and it's there. That's a little bit of a special case in that they didn't have a whole lot of options, but as it is, it was built there and it was not built to withstand tsunami forces. What I do not know about that particular hospital is how far in the tsunami zone it is. I don't know if it's like where they're expecting 3 or 4 feet or if they're actually expecting significant waves such that the building would be damaged. I don't know. But it was built before Unprepared was done and has not been modified since. Make sure taggers have a supply. So make sure taggers have a supply of green, yellow, and red paint. Yes, but what we're actually going to do is make sure that they have tags that tell you exactly what the tag means. So there will be standardized tags that are colored red, yellow, and green that will be prepared and put on them as they go through to do work, which should make it a lot easier. A red tag does not mean the building has to be destroyed. A red tag just means there are significant things that either need to be evaluated further or fixed before it's safe to go in the building. So there will be a lot more red tags than there will be buildings that will be torn down. It's just, it's a matter of something needs to be fixed before it's safe to be in there. Okay, this is clarifying my question earlier. Is any organization quantifying the total cost of the potential future damage, the total cost to mitigate these risks, and the percentage of funding that governments are allocated? Some parts of that, yes. So like the CEI hub project that we're working on right now is estimating the costs and costs in environmental considerations, in other words, that would be affected by that that area. The Dogami work was used to do some potential damage costs. I do not think that we've gotten to the stage where we're looking at total cost to mitigate risks, or the percentage of funding that governments, we're not to that state. I think we're just trying to estimate the total cost. There was some work that you may did at Dogami early in the 90s that came up with some cost estimates and some casualty estimates based on modeling, and that is being refined. But I don't think that we've gotten into mitigating risks, et cetera. The CEI hub is actually looking, the county and city are looking at what they need to require them to have an insurance, was a lot of what that's going for. Excuse me, I'm sorry, URM meaning is unreinforced masonry buildings. So what the city of Portland was trying to do was to tag unreinforced masonry buildings as unsafe during an earthquake because they are collapse prone. Do you see any prospects for requiring or funding seismic retrofits for vulnerable URMs? We tried and it failed. The two main things that made it fail were they came in and decided that it was racist and unfair because a lot of the buildings were in minority areas. Some of them were churches in minority areas. And I was, frankly, this is my opinion, but I was disappointed by that because honestly, our vulnerable populations are the ones that are at most risk. And what they should have been doing is saying, yeah, we'll put a tag up and then we're going to go ask for funding to fix it, because those are the populations that need those community centers to be active and running. And they need to be warned of it. It is unfair to not put it in there. And then the second argument that I think was the final clincher was they won freedom of speech somehow, is that it was against their freedom of speech to put something on the building. And I don't know the technicalities of it, but the issue is that could even go to like fire warnings and all kinds of other things. And so it got kind of complicated, but in the end, it killed the initiative. So the city and the county are going to try again. They're just going to do it in a different way. Carrie made a comment that she said we were riding in an elevator during an earthquake in PDX and the folks on the top floor felt it and the people in the elevator didn't even. So we need to have warnings that there can be earthquakes. People can get earthquake early warnings on their phone. I will try to find the link. You can Google it's Shake Alert is what it is. You can Google Shake Alert and find it, or look for Shake Alert. There's a couple different brands that have it available. Look for Shake Alert, not earthquake early warning. False alarm is a lot like a fire drill for everybody, yes. Especially if we don't have education about the false alarm. I mean, if we are not educated that that is a potential, then it's a problem. And somebody else provided the www.shakealert.org to get the app. If an existing residence is 60 to 90% rehab, there is no requirement for this resident to be tied down to the foundation. Why is this? I'm not necessarily sure about that entirety. I know that once you get to a certain point, you do have to. I mean, I've had friends who have had to both tie it to the foundation as well as do structural. So I'm not sure. But that's another piece where we really need to start legislating and putting things into code that require it to go above and beyond what we have now. Jill posts, Shake Alert. People are posting more links to the Shake Alert. Rick thinks we need ladders like the Chileans had. We need a lot of ladders. How Christchurch is doing relative to their recovery in their past earthquakes. Christchurch has actually had a bunch of interesting pieces. And I have not checked in with them lately. There were whole areas of liquefaction areas that they just never rebuilt. And it was interesting because it liquefied during the first earthquake and then also liquefied during the second earthquake. So they just didn't rebuild those areas. It was 3 or 4 years later that there were still neighborhoods that did not have water and wastewater. They had temporary water and were using porta potties and other types of things. So I honestly, I haven't checked in recently. The 5 or 6 years later, they were rebuilding in several areas, and they had, it was interesting. The Carmen Merlot went with the city. There were several people that went down to learn, and she has a really good presentation about it. There was interesting things to learn out of Christchurch, especially the fact that the citizens came together and came up with a plan and things they wanted to do, and the city council and the mayor ignored it and did other things, and it really created quite a bit of problems within it. There's a documentary called When Cities Fall that has a lot of information about the Christchurch earthquake. But yeah, I don't know as much about Christchurch because I didn't actually get to go to one of those. And they are working on not necessarily public money for the retrofitting of URMs, but loans and tax breaks to get that done. So that was part of what they were trying to do within the city of Portland when it died. So that will be something that they will try to do again. And there are some statewide things I think that were developed with the thought that it would be encouraging that. So the Shake Alert will not be using the emergency alert system. You have to have the actual app. Although for the early warning, I'm not sure when the emergency alert will actually go off. I would imagine that it will probably happen after you feel the shaking. There's no current concerning the Linton Fuel Depot, which is what I talked about. Is there any present activities in stabilizing the fuel depots? Currently, no. But the bill that Paul talked about early on is actually going to the legislature to require them to do seismic assessments and start to work that way. And then if they build anything new, they do have to fully design it to withstand shaking and liquefaction. It's one of the things that's hard, is I know there's a lot of push towards greener alternatives. And as much as I agree with that, we haven't built any new pipelines. All of our pipelines are old. All of our docks and everything are old. I mean, if we had a new pipeline, we'd at least have one that wasn't leaking and might work. So I think that we have to think kind of outside the box in some of these areas. As much as we need to get off fossil fuels, I don't know how soon that will happen. Yes, there's an organization for recruiting, training, and deploying the engineers to tag the buildings. That's the program I talked about, the bill that we wrote and the program. So that is exactly what it is. There will be a state program to do that, starting to be organized March 1st. BNSF's railroad bridge is very likely to fit. Oh, yeah. Because so basically the railroads could be a critical lifeline. Why are they not? Why isn't it ever mentioned? Because the railroads are very private, do their own thing, and have a lot of pull everywhere, and nobody has the ability to make them do that. So I do understand that there's been quite a bit of work on the Washington side in some of those areas because they have new infrastructure up there. But I anticipate that we will have a lot of failures on the rail lines all over. More links to Shake Alert answers. So seismic vulnerability of Pacific Northwest dams and the Washington State nuclear plant. We don't have a nuclear plant anymore. That was decommissioned. Is there another one that I don't know about? So the dams are actually far enough east that they will have minimal shaking effects, and they're all built on rock. Minimal shaking effects from the Cascadia subduction zone. So we don't have to worry really about those dams during the Cascadia subduction zone event. That said, there are several of them that are built much closer to local faults. So there is vulnerability for more local earthquakes, but in that case, it will be a more local event as opposed to an overall regional event. There are other dams in the Cascades and in the valley that are vulnerable. Part of the governor's plan, that seismic package that did not pass, included a lot of dam evaluation for that reason. And like I said, I don't know about the nuclear plant. I actually thought we decommissioned that. So Universal design for tagging. Some people are colorblind. It will say what it is on there. So it will have that included. It will say what it means. Is there a candidate for governor who's up to speed and can get legislation passed regarding all of the issues? I would not say that I know of any of the candidates who are super passionate about this. Betsy Johnson, who's gonna make it really interesting, has been a vocal advocate for and a vocal advocate against both of them. She's kind of a mixed bag in that case. The other ones, I don't think any of them have necessarily brought it up as a major issue. So that is one of the things I look to find out when we start to listen and talk to all of them in the 2022 race. So Betsy Johnson has been a major advocate for me when we're down there. And then she's also been a major roadblock. So as much as she is very well educated in all of the things that we've been talking about, especially the fuel systems, because she's the representative up there, I don't know what her thoughts are going to be on that. Suggest someone look into the cell phone capacity before you get on everybody's cell phone. 500,000 subscribers, the phone system. They've considered that for the earthquake early warning, and I can't speak to that. But Shake Alert probably has some information on it, and you can actually, there's the people in there are fairly easy to get to answer questions. Oh, UMA says we are going to get at the earthquake early warnings, but I got different information on that. So I would just look up the Shake Alert and see what it says. Bill says he's on a lot of City of Portland and Metro planning committees, and many mentioned that a bridge might be seismically vulnerable. Haven't seen a map that eliminates seismic routes. There are now. Bill, look up the RDPO emergency transportation routes.
Okay.
And that whether they'll be funded because it's on there is coming up in phase 2. So that's coming. And from ODOT standpoint, they are funding them because they are on their seismic safety lifeline routes.
Great.
Most of us viewing your talk are assessing the probability of a major seismic event in our lifetime. Is there a high So yes, I didn't touch on that because multiple people have given that presentation here before. There is a 37% chance in the next 50 years that we will have a magnitude 8 or above failure on the Cascadia subduction zone. And I think it's 17% of a 9 or above. When Japan had their 2011 9.0 earthquake, they had a 20% chance in 50 years that it would happen. So yes, we all look at it as it could happen tomorrow. More information on Shake Alert. I agree that connecting a resident to the foundation should be a priority for everybody. You're going to want to stay at home. You're not going to want to be a shelter, and you're not going to want to try to find a shelter. So anything you can do to make your home seismically safe so that you can be safe and be prepared to stay in it for the 2 weeks to 2 months or whatever it's going to take to get things up and running is the best advice you can get. And then worry about satiating behind Columbia River dams where landslides are falling into the reservoirs. And yes, Bill, that is an issue. It's just they're far enough east that the shaking is lower out there. So those dams are more vulnerable if they have a local earthquake on some of the faults that are a lot closer to those dams. And yes, the dam safety assessment would include landslides, et cetera, around those areas. The dams themselves are usually built into something that is not going to landslide, but you do have to worry about around the dams. But yes, a dam, I would assume a dam safety assessment would think about that. So I think I got through all of the questions. Did anybody have anything I missed? Did I say anything wrong?
What's SAP stand for?
Oh, excuse me, Safety Assessment Program. So damage, post-disaster damage assessment is what the ORSAP program is. So the red tag, yellow tag, green tag.
Yeah, I thought you are just a wealth of knowledge, and thanks for sharing it with everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Allison. And so everyone, let's tend to